Hello, my friends. Did you know that one of the greatest musicians in history died believing he was writing music for his own funeral? Some people say Mozart was a miracle sent by God. Others say he was simply a troubled man with too many debts, too many emotions, and too many mistakes. But here is the strange part. How could a man surrounded by unpaid bills, sickness, arguments, and fear create music so beautiful that people still cry when they hear it today? His name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and this story will help your English. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and write "Ready" in the comments if you want to learn English through powerful true stories. On a freezing night in Vienna in December 1791, Mozart lay in bed unable to move properly. His body was swollen, his face looked pale and weak. A fever burned through him like fire. Near him sat his wife, Constance. She watched helplessly as the famous composer struggled to breathe. Yet even in that terrible condition, Mozart's mind stayed focused on music. A young student named Franz Xaver Süssmayr stood beside the bed, holding sheets of paper. Mozart whispered musical instructions to him between painful breaths. He was trying to finish a requiem. A requiem is a special piece of music written for the dead, and Mozart had begun to believe he was writing it for himself. Can you imagine that? A dying man composing music about death, while death slowly approached his own bed. That moment became one of the most mysterious scenes in music history. But to understand how Mozart reached that dark room in Vienna, we must travel far back to the beginning of his life. Back to Salzburg. Back to a little boy whose extraordinary talent amazed all of Europe. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born on January 27, 1756, in Salzburg, Austria. He was the youngest of 7 children, but only he and his sister Nannerl survived into adulthood. From the beginning, Mozart seemed unusual. At 3 years old, he could already play simple notes on the harpsichord. At 4, he began creating tiny musical pieces of his own. His father, Leopold Mozart, immediately understood something important. His son was not normal. Leopold himself was a musician and teacher. He was intelligent, disciplined, and extremely ambitious. He dreamed of success and recognition, and when he saw Wolfgang's incredible talent, he decided to dedicate his life to developing it. Soon, the little boy was no longer simply a child. He became a performer. When Mozart was only 6 years old, his father took him and Nannerl on long tours across Europe. They traveled through Munich, Vienna, Paris, London, Amsterdam, and many other cities. Everywhere they went, rich nobles and royal families gathered to watch the tiny musical genius. Imagine the scene. A candlelit palace hall, beautiful golden walls, important kings and queens sitting silently. And in the middle of the room stood a very small boy in elegant clothes, placing his fingers gently on the keyboard. Then suddenly, music filled the room like magic. People could hardly believe what they were hearing. One famous story says, young Mozart jumped onto the lap of Empress Maria Theresa and kissed her after performing. The audience laughed with delight. Europe fell in love with the child genius. But behind the applause was another reality. The tours were exhausting. The roads were rough and dangerous. The family traveled for weeks inside uncomfortable carriages. Mozart often became sick and complained about sore fingers and painful muscles. He practiced constantly. He performed constantly. He worked constantly. A prodigy is a child with extraordinary ability, far beyond normal people of the same age. Mozart was a prodigy, but he was also a little boy who barely had a normal childhood. While other children played games and made friends, Mozart spent his days performing for strangers in expensive rooms. His father controlled almost every part of his life. Leopold loved his son deeply, but he also pushed him relentlessly. That relationship shaped Mozart forever. Here is the surprise. Those endless tours across Europe gave Mozart something priceless. He heard many styles of music from different countries. In London, he met Johann Christian Bach, an important composer who greatly influenced him. Mozart learned quickly. His mind absorbed melodies, rhythms, and harmonies everywhere he traveled. Harmony means different musical sounds working beautifully together. By his teenage years, Mozart could already compose music better than many adult musicians. But talent alone did not create his greatness. He studied obsessively. He rewrote his music again and again. He practiced until his hands hurt. Years later, people would imagine Mozart magically hearing perfect music inside his head. But the truth was more human. Mozart worked harder than almost anyone around him. And despite becoming famous across Europe, he still struggled with something painful inside himself. He wanted freedom. As Mozart entered his 20s, he grew increasingly unhappy in Salzburg. He believed the city was too small for his ambitions. He worked for the Archbishop of Salzburg, a powerful ruler named Hieronymus Colloredo. At first, the position seemed respectable, but Mozart hated it. The archbishop treated musicians like servants instead of artists. Mozart was ordered around, controlled, and constantly criticized. Worse still, the archbishop often refused to let him travel freely or accept outside opportunities. Mozart felt trapped. One evening, during an argument in 1781, the conflict exploded. Mozart tried to resign from his position, but the archbishop resisted angrily. Voices rose. Tempers burned. Then something shocking happened. The archbishop's steward, Count Arco, physically kicked Mozart out of the room. Yes, one of history's greatest musical geniuses was literally kicked away like a servant. That humiliation changed his life forever. Mozart later described it bitterly as a kick in the arse. Suddenly, he understood something clearly. If he stayed in Salzburg, he would never truly be free. So Mozart made a dangerous decision. He left. At that time, most musicians depended completely on kings, nobles, or churches for money. Independent artists were extremely rare, but Mozart wanted to become something new, a freelance musician. Freelance means working independently instead of working permanently for one employer. It was a risky dream. His father was furious. Leopold warned him repeatedly that freedom without security could destroy his future. He begged his son to return to the archbishop and keep a stable position. But Mozart refused. For the first time in his life, he chose his own path. That decision created a deep wound between father and son. Yet Mozart continued forward toward Vienna, the great musical capital of Europe, and there his life would completely change. In Vienna, Mozart quickly attracted attention. People admired his brilliant piano performances. Wealthy families invited him into elegant homes to perform and teach lessons. Soon he became known as one of the finest keyboard players in the entire city. Then came another important moment. In December 1781, Mozart participated in a famous musical competition before Emperor Joseph I. His opponent was Muzio Clementi, an excellent Italian pianist. The audience watched carefully as both musicians performed difficult pieces with incredible skill. Mozart's playing amazed people. Fast, emotional, elegant, and full of energy. Afterward, his reputation in Vienna grew rapidly. But music was not the only thing changing in his life. Mozart had fallen in love. He was living near the Weber family and became deeply attached to Constanze Weber. She was cheerful, warm, and lively. Mozart adored her. However, his father strongly disapproved of the relationship. Leopold worried about money, social status, and responsibility. But Mozart ignored the warnings. In August 1782, Mozart and Constanze married. The marriage happened quickly because there were concerns about Constanze's reputation after spending private time alone with Mozart. Reputation means the way society judges a person's character. Despite his father's objections, Mozart seemed truly happy during the early years of marriage, and professionally, he appeared unstoppable. He composed operas, symphonies, piano concertos, and chamber music at an incredible speed. A concerto is a musical work that highlights one main instrument together with an orchestra. Mozart organized his own concerts, sold tickets, taught wealthy students, and performed constantly. For a while, his risky decisions seemed successful, very successful. Records show he earned around 4,000 florins a year during his best years in Vienna. That was an enormous income for the time. A doctor might earn only around 600 florins annually. Mozart was becoming rich. He rented elegant apartments. He wore fashionable clothes. He entertained friends regularly. From the outside, his life looked glamorous. But then, the same man creating some of the most beautiful music in Europe could not control his spending. Mozart loved luxury. He spent money quickly on clothing, furniture, parties, and entertainment. He enjoyed expensive living and sometimes even gambled. No matter how much money arrived, it disappeared almost immediately. Soon, debts began piling up. Letters requesting loans became common in his life. Again and again, Mozart wrote desperately to friends asking for financial help. One close friend, Michael Puchberg, often lent him money. The situation became so serious that Mozart and Constanze occasionally had to move because they could not afford rent. Can you imagine the contradiction? A musical genius admired across Europe, yet constantly worried about bills. A man whose music sounded heavenly, yet trapped by very ordinary human problems. And perhaps that contradiction is exactly what made Mozart so fascinating. Because beneath the powdered wigs and legendary stories was not a perfect angel. He was human, emotional, impulsive, brilliant, and deeply flawed. So far, do you think Mozart's struggles made his music stronger? Write yes or no in the comments. By the late 1780s, Mozart's life had become increasingly complicated. His fame remained strong, but the excitement surrounding him slowly began to cool. Vienna's audiences changed quickly. New musicians arrived. Fashion changed. Some concerts no longer earned enough money. Meanwhile, Mozart's expenses stayed high, and then tragedy entered his home. Several of Mozart and Constanze's children died very young. In the 18th century, child mortality was sadly common, meaning many children died before becoming adults. Each loss deeply hurt Mozart. At the same time, his relationship with his father continued to suffer. Leopold Mozart had once controlled every part of Wolfgang's career, but now the distance between them felt enormous. Letters between father and son became colder and more painful. Then in 1787, Leopold died. Mozart was devastated. Although they had argued for years, the emotional bond between them remained powerful. Suddenly, Mozart was alone in a way he had never experienced before. But even during emotional suffering, his creativity exploded. This is one of the greatest mysteries about him. The more difficult life became, the deeper his music seemed to grow. One of the clearest examples was his opera Don Giovanni. At first glance, it looked like a dramatic story about a charming man who seduced women and ignored moral rules. But underneath the surface, the opera explored something darker: freedom, pleasure, death, punishment. Don Giovanni himself was fearless, rebellious, and dangerously proud. Mozart's music gave every character a unique emotional voice. Funny scenes suddenly became tragic. Light melodies transformed into terrifying darkness. Audiences laughed one moment and felt chills the next. That balance was genius. Here is the surprise. Mozart was not simply writing entertainment. He was exploring human nature itself. Signature scene number 1 came during the opera's final moments. Imagine a dark dinner hall lit by candles, Don Giovanni laughing arrogantly. And then suddenly, a terrifying stone statue enters the room. The music becomes heavy and thunderous. The statue invites Don Giovanni to repent, meaning to admit his sins and change his behavior. But Don Giovanni refuses. Then the music explodes into chaos as he is dragged toward destruction. People watching the opera were stunned. The scene felt supernatural and frightening, and Mozart created it while dealing with stress, debt, illness, and emotional pain in his own life. Can you imagine that? A struggling man creating music so emotionally powerful that audiences still feel shocked centuries later. Another masterpiece soon followed, The Magic Flute. At first, the opera appeared simple and playful. There were magical instruments, funny characters, adventures, and beautiful songs. Children could enjoy it. Adults could enjoy it. But beneath the fairy tale was a hidden world of symbols and philosophy. Mozart belonged to a secretive brotherhood called the Freemasons. The Freemasons valued enlightenment, wisdom, brotherhood, and reason. Enlightenment means gaining deeper understanding and knowledge. These ideas appeared throughout. The Magic Flute. The opera told the story of Prince Tamino and Princess Pamina, overcoming difficult trials to reach truth and wisdom. The number 3 appeared repeatedly because it held symbolic meaning in Freemasonry. Darkness fought against light. Ignorance fought against wisdom. Fear fought against hope. Yet Mozart balanced all these ideas with unforgettable melodies that ordinary people could still sing and love. That was his extraordinary gift. He could combine deep intellectual meaning with pure emotional beauty. And despite the myth that Mozart created music effortlessly, the truth was completely different. He worked obsessively. He revised pieces repeatedly. He studied other composers carefully. He practiced endlessly. His hands reportedly showed physical signs of years of hard labor at the keyboard. Mozart himself once explained that no one had spent more time studying composition than he had. Genius was only part of the story. Discipline mattered too. But then, everything changed in 1791. Mozart's final year began with both success and growing fear. The magic flute became popular in Vienna, bringing him happiness and renewed recognition. Yet his physical condition worsened rapidly. He suffered fevers, exhaustion, swelling, and terrible weakness. Doctors at the time called it acute miliary fever, but modern experts still debate the true cause of his death. Some researchers believe he suffered from a severe infection that damaged his kidneys. Others disagree. The exact answer remains unknown. And during this period, a mysterious stranger arrived at Mozart's home. The man wore black clothing and carried an unusual request. He asked Mozart to compose a requiem. The client's identity had to remain secret. Half the payment was offered immediately, with the rest promised after completion. The strange commission fascinated Mozart. Soon, he became completely consumed by the music. Consumed means mentally and emotionally overwhelmed by something. Day after day, Mozart worked intensely on the Requiem, but something disturbing began happening. He started believing the music was connected to his own death. Constanze later remembered him, saying he felt he was writing the Requiem for himself. The closer death came, the more emotionally powerful the music became. Signature scene number 2 happened on December 4th, 1791. Mozart was now extremely weak. He could barely move in bed. Yet he invited several friends to gather around him for one final musical session. Candles flickered softly in the dark room. The unfinished sheets of the Requiem rested nearby. Friends sang parts of the composition, while Mozart quietly corrected details and gave instructions. Sometimes he even attempted to sing along. Imagine that heartbreaking image. A dying composer surrounded by unfinished music, trying desperately to complete one last masterpiece before time ran out. The next morning, December 5th, 1791, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died. He was only 35 years old. News of his death shocked Vienna, and almost immediately, myths began growing around him. Some claimed Antonio Salieri had poisoned him. A myth is a widely repeated story that is not actually true. Centuries later, the famous movie Amadeus made this idea extremely popular, but historians have found very little evidence supporting the poisoning story. In reality, Mozart and Salieri likely respected each other professionally. They even collaborated on music at times. The truth was less dramatic than the legend. Mozart most likely died from illness, not murder. Another myth claimed Mozart was buried in a poor man's grave because nobody cared about him. That is also misleading. At the time in Vienna, many middle-class citizens were buried in common graves according to local customs. Mozart's funeral was modest, but not unusual for that period. Still, the myths survived because people struggled to understand something extraordinary. How could a deeply flawed human being create such perfect beauty? After Mozart's death, Constanze faced a terrifying problem. The Requiem remained unfinished, and without a completed composition, the mysterious client would not pay the remaining money. So, she turned to Mozart's student, Franz Xaver Süssmayr, Sussmayer studied Mozart's sketches carefully and completed missing sections in Mozart's style. Today, experts believe most of the Requiem was truly Mozart's work, while some portions were finished by Sussmayer. The completed Requiem became one of the most emotional and famous musical works ever written. And perhaps that is the final Mozart paradox. His life was chaotic, his finances were unstable, his relationships were difficult. He worried constantly. He made mistakes. He suffered. Yet from all that human imperfection came music of astonishing beauty and balance. Maybe perfection in art does not come from having a perfect life. Maybe it comes from transforming pain into something meaningful. And that is why Mozart still matters today. Not because he was superhuman, but because he was human. A man with fears, weaknesses, desires, and struggles, who somehow turned all of it into music that still touches hearts centuries later. Mozart's story reminds us that greatness is not the absence of struggle. In fact, struggle may sometimes become the very thing that deepens human creativity. The little boy who traveled across Europe performing for kings became a man who fought for freedom, battled debt, experienced heartbreak, and still created music that feels immortal. Immortal means something remembered forever. Even today, people around the world listen to Mozart when they feel joy, sadness, hope, or loneliness. His music continues speaking across centuries because it came from real human emotion. And perhaps that is what truly makes art timeless. Thank you for listening to this story. May you continue learning English with curiosity, peace, and success. Keep learning, keep growing, and never stop creating beauty from your own struggles. Lessons. Great talent still requires discipline and hard work. Human struggles do not always destroy creativity. Sometimes they deepen it. Freedom often requires courage and difficult choices. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments. Do you believe Mozart was born a genius, or did his struggles help create his greatness?